phone, it's a little bit trickier to find, but you might have to open it up at the bottom, and you're going to have an option of A, B, C, or D. So we're going to have a few questions to go through here just to get us warmed up. So the first one, since our theme is wildlife in winter, what is the coldest temperature ever recorded in Canada? So I'm going to go ahead and launch our poll. You should see it pop up on your screen. If not, just go to the bottom and let us know. If you have a large class, you can discuss as a class and try to see what the most common answer is. And then you can go ahead and put it in there. Do we think the coldest temperature in Canada was, oh, and just so we all know, we're not all from Canada, but this is degrees Celsius. So we're thinking in degrees Celsius. Minus 75, minus 63, minus 58, or minus 49. I don't know about you all, but I mean, I maybe have felt minus 49 once with wind chill, but I have never felt something even close to minus 75. So I see we have a couple answers coming in here. We're thinking minus 63. Maybe give you another minute, especially if you have a bigger class. Oh, a couple C's here coming in at minus 58. A last call if anyone else has any answers. Okay, so for this first question, the answer is actually minus 63 degrees Celsius. So the coldest temperature ever recorded was in Yukon, minus 63 degrees Celsius. But if you look at the average coldest temperature, the coldest location is actually in Nunavut. So on average, they're the coldest, but Yukon did have that one really, really cold day where they got that minus 63. All right, let's take a look at question 2. What is the snowiest location? So where do we think gets the most snow in Canada? And welcome to our schools that are just popping in. Nice to have you. And for those of us joining on YouTube, if you're joining on YouTube, you're welcome to go ahead and pop your answers into the chat there as well. My colleague Sarah is able to see those and they can share them with us too. So the snowiest location, is it Woody Point, Newfoundland? Is it the North Pole? Is it where I am in Edmonton, Alberta? Or Iqaluit, Nunavut? Where do we think gets the most snow in all of Canada? Now, if you're someone who's in charge of shoveling your own sidewalk, I think you might think it's to your house sometimes. Although I will say for me, last winter, we barely had to shovel. It was super awesome. It's not always the case. Okay, I do see a couple of D's. A couple of us are thinking Nunavut. That's pretty far north. It's pretty cold there. That's a really good guess. I also went through and I found a couple pictures of this one so we can see what it looks like. Okay, last call. Any last guesses on what the snowiest location in Canada is? All right. And the correct answer is actually Woody Point, Newfoundland. So you see these couple of pictures here from big snow dumps. This has the highest snowfall over a typical winter. It can get something like 6 meters of snow in just 90 days. 6 meters. That's like so tall. So you can see them trying to get their buried cars out of the snow there. I don't know if we have any schools joining from Newfoundland for this one. If there are, it would be awesome to see you in the chat. Okay, a couple more. How many polar bears live in Canada's Arctic? Now, Haley and I were just chatting before we started. Is there really any way to count every single polar bear? No. This is a best guess. What is our best guess of how many polar bears we have? Is it less than 200, about 1,000, about 9,000, or about 16,000? Ooh, we're quick on the guesses on this one. What do we think? Okay, last call for answers for this one. How many polar bears are in the Arctic? Now, I'm getting a lot of A, B's, and C's. I think it's because we hear a lot about how much the polar bears are struggling with the ice melt. So those are really good guesses, but I have some good news for you all. The correct answer is actually D. We have about 16,000 polar bears. Now, I know that sounds like a lot, but the Canadian Arctic is gigantic. So of course we would like a lot more than that. So they are ones whose numbers are a little bit lower than what we'd like to see. Okay, my last question, and I put a little picture of some migration patterns on here for you. Which animal has the farthest yearly migration? Any animal on the planet. Now, this is not just Canadian animals, this is any animal. Is it the Arctic tern, which is a bird, the Canada goose, the painted lady butterfly, which are those orange ones you've probably seen before, or the red-throated hummingbird? Now, I'll tell you, I picked these 4 because these are 4 that have gigantic migration. So they're all good guesses. Which one do you think is the farthest, though? Also, how wonderful would it be to see a giant migration of butterflies come through your town? I would love that. Or hummingbirds, honestly. Ooh, a contentious question I see in the chat. What do we think? And I put a picture of the answer for this one so you can all see what it looks like in case you're not familiar with it. And welcome. I see as we're doing our last question here, a few more schools are jumping into our Zoom call. It's so nice to see you. If you have a minute, it would be great if you let us know where you're joining from in your name. So just click those 3 dots next to your name and you can put your city or your province or your country so that we can see where our different classes are joining from. Okay, I'm ending the last poll. The correct answer is A, the Arctic tern. So this one actually travels 90,000 kilometers, basically from the North Pole to the South Pole every year. So out of any animal in the entire world, that's the farthest one. Pretty crazy. All right, thank you very much. And I do see a couple of us have said hello in the chat. That's awesome to see. Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is Wildlife in Winter. Do they stay or do they go? We're going to be talking all about what animals in Canada do to deal with our cold winter. It's great to have you all saying hi and good morning. So I see Little Falls, Fundy National Park, New Brunswick. You guys probably get a lot of snow. If you guys want to say good morning in the chat, that's great to see. If you have any questions, go ahead and pop those in the chat as well. That's why we have our guest presenter here with us today. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining from a Miskwachiwaskahikan. This is colonially known as Edmonton, Alberta, and it's found on Treaty 6 territory. This land has been a traditional meeting grounds, gathering place, and traveling route to many groups, including the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and the Nakota Sioux for time immemorial. I would also like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today, as we're meeting on a virtual platform that covers many different lands and territories that we each call home. Now, acknowledging traditional Indigenous lands that we reside on is an important first step in the reconciliation process, so that we might be able to improve our relationship with our environment and all of the living things that share our home. Today, as we take a more meaningful look into our connection with the living world around us, I want us all to take time to appreciate those who have served as protectors of those lands for time in past. So I invite you all during the event to keep this in the front of your minds and really appreciate those past and continued efforts of Indigenous groups to conserve that delicate balance of plants and animals in our changing world. Now, just a little bit of housekeeping. This is what our event is going to look like today. We did save some time at the end for you to ask questions or share. So a great thing for you teachers to do is during the event, maybe have your students come up with a couple good questions, write them down so you have them ready. Of course, you're welcome to type them in the chat during the presentation. Just no guarantee we'll get to them during it, but we'll save lots of time at the end. So lots of options for you as well. If you have a student who wants to ask a question on camera, you just have to raise your hand and the little emoji option, and we can call on you, and they're welcome to ask them live as well. So both good options. Oh yes, and of course I want to welcome all of our schools. So we have lots of schools registered for our live event. And of course, there's many that are not listed here who will be joining us later on YouTube. So welcome to you as well. So I hope you guys are able to see your school up here. You can see we've got lots of Canadian schools, but of course, a few schools joining us from around the world wanting to learn a little bit more about the Canadian winter. So Egypt, Costa Rica, Bangladesh, Nigeria. Hopefully you guys learn a little bit about how our animals cope with our freezing cold temperatures today. And I would like to welcome our guest presenter. So Kaylee Setter is from Calgary, Alberta, and is an experiential education manager at the Canadian Wildlife Federation. As part of the education team, she works to connect people with nature through hands-on learning activities and conservation projects. From the mountains to the grasslands, she's collaborated with conservation researchers and scientists across the country to educate people of all ages about Canada's wildlife, habitats, and real-world conservation work on the ground. So welcome, Kaylee.
Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. It's so nice to be with you today and get to talk a bit about wildlife and winter. Hopefully, you're all still experiencing some really nice fall weather right now. But as we know, winter's coming. So it's a great time to chat about this and think a bit about what animals do. So I hope everyone can see my slides now. I'm going to dive right in and we're going to talk about it because sometimes wildlife stays, sometimes they go, kind of like people. So I want to start off by just asking, what you think of winter. Some people love winter. They love getting out in the snow, maybe skiing, playing, making forts, snow angels. So if you love snow, I'd love to know, like, give me a thumbs up, maybe a thumbs up reaction, or if your camera's on, give me a thumbs up. If you think it's okay and you don't mind like cozying up inside, having a hot chocolate, just like a snow tolerator, then that's kind of this middle reaction, yeah, maybe. And then if you hate it, if you really don't like snow, you fear it, it's too cold, you'd rather go on a vacation somewhere warm, that's a thumbs down reaction. Like you want to go to Florida, you want to go somewhere with a beach. Because some people, they just say, I've had it, I'm getting out of here. So some of us are snow lovers, snow tolerators, snow haters. And there's actually a word for that. So Keanophile is from the Greek word for snow, keon. Keanophile is a snow lover. So those who love snow, you're a keanophile. Keanophore is basically snow tolerator. So if you're that one who thought maybe, you're a keanophore. And if you're the one who really hates it or fears it, you're a keanophobe. You're afraid of the snow. So, some humans love it, some humans don't. It's kind of the same with wildlife. So if we think about wildlife, there are three main responses to winter. They're the ones that are afraid, that they hate it, they're going to migrate. They're going to leave. They're going to go somewhere else where it's warmer, where they can find food. So a lot of birds and things, they just go. The second one is kind of the tolerator. Like, okay, well, I maybe don't have the right adaptations to really be active in the winter, but I'm okay. I'll hibernate, I'll rest, I'll store up, and I'll just make it through the winter and come out again in the spring and be ready for action. And then finally, there's those who love the snow. Those are the ones who adapt. So they have the adaptations, the characteristics that allow them to do really well in the cold. And we'll talk a bit about those, but you can see that wildlife and people are really similar in some ways, and that in some cases we're migrating, in some cases we're kind of nesting and hibernating. In other cases, we adapt to the cold. And for us as people, that's putting on jackets, coats, hats, all those layers so that we can go out and enjoy the winter too. So we're going to go through these three today and talk a bit about what kinds of animals stick around, which ones leave, and which ones kind of hunker down for the winter.
Kaylee, I have a question for you. Since it seems like a lot of our schools are a little camera shy this morning and we're not going to be able to see their thumbs, would it be helpful if I launched a poll for the questions?
Sure, yeah. So as we go along, we're going to talk a bit about all three. And then what we'll do later is I'm going to put up pictures and we want you to guess. So we want you to guess if you think they're a lover, a hater, or a tolerator. So yeah, if Rebecca, you're able to launch a poll, that's fantastic. For those of you who want to use those reactions or have their cameras on, we've got all kinds of options for you to tell us, or even just type it in the chat. Perfect. So snow lovers have all these amazing characteristics and adaptations that let them really thrive in the winter, or at the very least survive. You can see some of the pictures here. I'll just walk you through. This isn't an extensive list, but just some of the really cool ones that you might not be aware of, or maybe you are aware of. The top one there, you can see broad feet. So that's a picture of a Canada lynx paw. You can see how fuzzy it is. They're really big, so a lot of surface area, almost acts like a snowshoe on the snow. And if anyone's been snowshoeing, they know that if you've got that wide base, it distributes the weight so they don't sink in the snow. They kind of sit on top. So really furry, broad feet help them walk on the snow. The next one there is feathered legs. Some birds that stick around, if they didn't have feathers all over their legs would get cold and you'd lose a lot of heat through those legs. So some of the really well-adapted winter birds have feathers all the way down their legs. They have like fuzzy boots on. And you can see their feet too, much like the lynx. A lot of the feathers do the same thing, where you can walk on the snow and stay on top of snowdrifts. So some really cool feet adaptations. A lot of animals have layers of fat or blubber that helps insulate them. So just like putting on our warm jackets, they've got really thick insulating layers so that they can tolerate the cold and stay warm. A lot of sea mammals like whales, or you see a seal there, they've got really thick layers. Even polar bears have a really thick layer of fat that helps insulate. So it's like really good layers to keep them warm. And even some behaviors help us adapt to winter. So if you think about shivering, we shiver. When we get cold, we shiver. That's an adaptation. Our muscles contract and it creates energy, which heats us up. So when people get really cold, you'll start to shiver, and that's to help you heat back up. But animals do that too, and birds will even do that. They'll shiver, and not only does it help heat them up, but it fluffs up their feathers, and more air gets in between the feathers, and that's better insulation. So they'll fluff up their feathers so they're really fluffy, and the shivering helps heat them up, but also then the extra air in their feathers makes them more insulated, just like those down jackets. So it's a really cool trick they do to poof up. A lot of the birds will just poof their feathers up. I'm sure some people have seen that some animals just change colors. So that's a picture of a snowshoe hare. They're brown in the summer. When the winter starts to come, there's some changes that happen, and their fur will start to turn white. A lot of birds and things, their plumage will turn white as well, so they can blend in better with snow. You can imagine that with camouflage, if you're in a brown leaf environment, it's much better to be brown. But as soon as the snow falls and everything's really white, you would stand out so well to predators. They would see you running across the snow. So a lot of animals that are active in the snow turn white, white feathers, white fur, so they blend in better to their environment. And then even when you think about fur, the thickness of their fur. So they have lots of layers, really thick insulating layers, sometimes double layers. So they have a woolly layer close to the skin and then long furs to trap that air and that heat. So a lot of mammals and things have really thick insulating fur. For small mammals, things like that pika, they have small ears, they have small tail, they have small hands, because if there's a smaller surface area, there's less space for the heat to evaporate. So everything's kind of small and condensed, so you don't lose heat. If you had big ears and a long tail and long arms, that's just more area for the heat to escape. So you'll see a lot of winter animals are very small, concise, and small ears. Plants are like that too. Plants that live in cold areas, they grow really small, close to the ground. So just smaller features in general. And then another one I think we've seen quite a bit is if you think about penguins, huddling. So behaviors where you just get really close with others, maybe like deer and bison and things, they'll huddle. Penguins do that to block out wind because it can get really cold. Penguins live in Antarctica and big winds come through. And so they take turns being on the outside and the inside. One penguin doesn't get to always be on the inside, they rotate so that they can kind of be a bit of a windbreak. So again, these are not all the adaptations, but just some really cool ones to think about that really help animals who stick around in the winter survive and thrive in these really cold temperatures. The second one is the snow tolerators. And remember we said they maybe don't love it, but they'll stick around, they can make it work. Well, that often means they're hibernators. So hibernation is a state where animals' bodies function. It slows down. And that's what can conserve energy when it's cold. So hibernation, they'll eat a lot of food right before winter. They'll snack really and get lots of energy stored up in their bodies so that they can stay dormant for a long period over the winter when it's cold. And as you can imagine, in winter, there's not a lot of access to food. There's not as many plants and things to eat. So it's hard. You've got to really store up before you have hibernation. And you have to think about hibernation as a bit of a spectrum, because not everything hibernates for the same amount of time. So on the deep end, we call it hibernation. That's long-term dormancy inactivity. Like they're out for a long time. They store up and they're out for a few months, maybe the whole winter. True hibernators don't wake up in the middle of the winter. And that you see another word there on the screen, brumation. Hibernation is for warm-blooded animals. Brumation is actually what cold-blooded animals do. So snakes and amphibians, they also get cold, but they don't eat a bunch of food and have energy. Because they're cold-blooded, their systems just kind of shut down. Their body temperature's lower. So very similar, but hibernation's warm-blooded. Brumation is for cold-blooded animals. So you're talking about true hibernators like marmots. You've got snapping turtles, little brown bats or snakes. They kind of go off and they will be inactive for a big chunk of the year. But not all animals sleep and hibernate for that whole period. And we call that torpor. So when it's short term, like little sporadic periods of hibernation, that's called torpor. So some animals, like bears and badgers, we think they're true hibernators, but they can actually get up in the winter, move around, eat things, drink water. So they're not as far on that hibernation spectrum. They can be woken up, get out and do things, but they do sleep for good chunks of the time in their dens. They're cozied up in there. And then torpor really, like there's some animals who just are inactive for like a night or an evening or a couple days. So birds, when it gets really cold, you might not see birds out. That they go into torpor, their body temperature gets lower and it slows down, but not for very long. Usually it's just for overnight while it's cold or maybe a day, and then they're active again. Same with mice, they'll kind of slow down, but they'll be active again. That's not really hibernation because they're not out for the whole winter, but you might not see them around at certain points when it gets really cold, and that's because they just slow their body temperatures down and they stop moving around, stop eating. So hopefully that makes sense. Think about it on that spectrum. Torpor is when you're just kind of slightly active and then you're waking up and kind of going back to sleep, whereas hibernation and brumation, like you're out for quite a while. You won't see those animals for quite a while. And then those snow fearers, so the ones who don't like the cold and they don't have all those great adaptations that allow them to live in the cold, and they're not going to stick around. That's the ones where they're migrating. So they are leaving, they're getting out of town. And migration, I think we think of migration always as north to south, but that's not the case. Migration is a movement of animals from any location to another. So you have to think it could be north to south, moving from Canada down through the US, maybe to Mexico. It could be east to west, from different climates that way. So we forget that, but it could be east to west. It can also be from high elevations, like maybe near tops of mountains, down to low valleys, because things get cold up high, they'll move down. So it can be up to down. And even circle routes. Some animals kind of take a big long route in a circle and end up where they started when they come back. So we have to remember when we think migration, not to just think about north-south, to think that, yeah, animals are traveling in all different paths, and different animals have different migratory routes. And that migration is often triggered by changes in the environment. So it's kind of like magic, really. And scientists are studying it and trying to figure out what is it that triggers animals to know, hey, it's time to get out of here. And a lot of it is, changes in the environment. So how much sunlight is there and daylight? Is the food kind of going away? Is the weather changing? And it's that changes in the environment that trigger those changes in behavior. And it's really interesting to note that those things are changing every year because the weather is changing and the climate's changing. And as the planet warms up or seasons change, maybe it gets colder or hotter sooner, that affects their migratory patterns. So it is changing the way animals are moving and where they're moving to. So really interesting studies around migration paths and how these animals move from place to place. And the other thing we remember, they can be really short migrations. It could take a couple hours. They could migrate to the valley, or it could be like that Arctic tern and take days and days to travel the length of the globe. And you can imagine, depending on how long your migratory route is, it could take a lot of energy. So even though they're not saving up energy to stick around in the winter, you might have to save a lot of energy to make that big, long journey. And they'll have stopping grounds if it's a long one, but they go hard and they get where they need to go, and it takes a lot of energy out of them. So some of the ones you can see there, I think we all are familiar with a lot of birds. We see them in the skies like Canada geese and things moving on their migrations. Sea turtles migrate. They do actually hang out in Canada in the summer. They feed off the shores in the summer, but then they get out of here and they actually go lay their eggs down south in the Caribbean, in the US, Mexico. So they have a long migratory path. Monarch butterflies will migrate, and they do it in stages because they don't have very long life cycles. So they'll generationally move from Canada and then down to Mexico and then kind of come back. So these are really big migrations for some insects. And whales, a lot of animals have these big paths. Fish too, some fish will migrate and then come back and just kind of follow where the food is or where the temperatures are right for their bodies. So really interesting migrations. And you can see some very cool videos. If you look them up on YouTube or on the internet, you can see some cool migrations. So I just found a couple graphics, some of the world's most incredible bird migrations. We learned at the beginning of the session, the Arctic tern has the longest migration route. It's at 96,000 kilometers because they go all the way from the North Pole to the South Pole. That is incredible. But many birds cover a lot of distance. And then I don't know if you're familiar with the monarch butterfly, for example, but you can see on that picture that they sort of live in the southern part of Canada, in the prairies, in parts of Ontario, and they'll migrate down. And you can see the green is their summer breeding territory, the yellow is their spring, and the purpley pink color is where they overwinter. So they're really covering the whole length of North America. And those are insects, so really small. You can imagine it takes them a long time to get where they want to go because they are not, they've got big, long legs, things to make them move fast. So with that, I want to ask you all, is this animal a snow lover, tolerator, or fearer? So I'm going to put up some pictures, and some of them are ones I've mentioned as we went through. And I want you to say, is it a snow lover? Is it a snow tolerator, do you think? Or is it a snow fear? And it sounds like we've got a few different ways that you can chime in. You can use that, just physically your hands there. You can put it in the chat, or it sounds like Rebecca maybe is going to do a poll as well. So hopefully you're all ready to test your knowledge. We're going to start off with the garter snakes. So do you think garter snakes are lovers of snow, so they're adapted to be in the cold? Are they tolerators of snow in that, okay, maybe they stick around, but maybe they're hibernating? Or do you think they're fearers and they're migrating, they're getting out of there? And I see we've got a few ones coming in already. It looks like, okay, yeah, most people are saying tolerators, think they hibernate. Perfect. Okay. Let's see. Yes, you're right. So I don't know if anyone's seen a snake hibernacula, but they'll go into caves or rocky areas and they'll go into brumation, right? Because they're reptiles. So that's the form of hibernation. And then they'll often come out in the spring. And I remember being on a conservation property one spring when they were all coming out from their hibernacula and the ground was just moving with all these snakes. It was crazy. So yeah, they're tolerators. They'll stick around, but they're not out and they're not active. Great job, everyone. Everybody knew that one. How about this bird? It's called a ptarmigan. This is when you see, I don't want to give too many hints. If I tell you where it lives, you might know what it is, but you can see it's a fluffy bird. You see them in Canada. Hint, hint, they live in northern areas. Some of the features you maybe notice, they're white. I wonder why they are white, maybe to blend in. Look at their feet, maybe. See what you think about their feet. You can see the feathers on their feet. Small beaks, small features, very fluffy. I think most people have guessed it. It is a snow lover. They're really well adapted. In fact, they're not even white. Like in the summer, they're more gray colored. This is in the winter, they get a bit more white. They get fluffier plumage. So you can see that they would blend in really well in the winter. So good job. Got good eyes for those adaptations. How about a leatherback sea turtle? We mentioned this one. Does anyone remember? It is one of those ones that lives in the ocean. We do have them in Canada. Do you think they stick around? Do you think they're adapted to live in this cold weather? I see Emily's like, no, not a chance. I see a lot of answers coming in and people are saying snow fears. They think they migrate. You are absolutely correct. They get out of town and they go to warmer climates. Great job, everyone. Okay, let's see if we can get some more challenging ones here. What about the mouse? Small little mice. Has anyone seen a mouse in the winter? Does anyone remember? Do you think they're adapted to? Do you think they're hibernating? Do you think they're leaving? Get their suitcases and leave. See the responses. People are pretty fast. I feel like you know your stuff now. We've kind of got a mix for this one, though. Some think they migrate. Some think they're hibernating. Some think they adapt. Tricky. This one is a bit tricky. I said I was going to test you. So it is a tolerator. They're not full hibernators, though. They go more into torpor. So they can adapt to decent temperatures. I think what's interesting about mice is they will live underneath the snow in what's called the subnivean layer. So they can stay insulated because it's much warmer closer to the ground. But when it gets really cold, they'll go into that torpor and they won't be as active. So it's like a mini hibernation. So that was a tricky one. And many of you got it, but that one is a little tricky because you might see them active if the temperatures aren't too cold. How about this Arctic fox? Maybe the hint is in the name, but look at their features. Look at their fur. Think about whether you think they would stick around in the winter. How would they do in a hot climate, do you think? Do you think that they would maybe be the opposite? Maybe they would be overheating, right? Some animals who do really well in cold temperatures can't live in hot temperatures. And that's a problem too with climates changing. If it gets too warm, they have a really tough time. But I think everybody agrees this one is a lover, and you are absolutely right. They actually turn white as well. Those Arctic foxes turn white, and they have fur, they have furry paws so they can walk on the snow. They're really good at adapting to winter. So great job. Everybody knew that one. How about little brown bats? And this one's a bit tricky because not all bats are the same, but this is a little brown bat. So what do you think? Do you think that little brown bats migrate, they get out because it's really cold? Do you think they hibernate, or do you think they're active in the winter and they have the adaptations?
Is it wrong that I don't know, so I'm just copying what the kids are putting in the poll? You guys are much smarter than me.
I see. Some think migrate and some think hibernate. So we're on the fence here. And it is a bit of a tricky one because it depends on the species of bat. This one, little brown bat, is a tolerator. So it will hibernate. They go into caves, they get in bunches, and they hibernate pretty deeply. They're not waking up very often. So you won't see them active. They lose a lot of heat, so they stick to hibernating. But some species will migrate further south. I think it's the hoary bat. They'll move. So depending on the species, some will migrate away, but others, they just hunker down. So it is a bit of a trick question because you have to do your research. But these guys, yeah, you're right. They hibernate. Now this one's got to be easy. What do you think? Polar bears, are they sticking around? Do they like the cold? Don't look at the background for any hints, hey? Look at the palm trees behind the polar bear. Everybody's like, they adapt, they adapt. You are right. Yes, they are so well adapted to cold weather. They have thick, fat layers. They have black skin, actually, so it'll absorb the heat from the sun. They have the translucent hair layer. So they got multiple layers of defense against the cold. And they're actually more active in the cold than in the summer. In the summer, it's sort of like their hibernation. They get more calm and relaxed and not as active in the summer. And when winter comes, they're out on the ice floes, they're hunting seals. So they are absolutely really well adapted to winter climates, especially in the north. Good job, everybody. Now, here's a very different species, ruby-throated hummingbirds. So hummingbirds are very little birds. I don't know if any of you have seen them. They're so cool, flap their wings really fast and have that long beak so they can eat nectar out of flowers. Yeah, small. I mean, so maybe some birds migrate, some birds stick around, some birds, maybe get into torpor. What do you think? Like, look at the feathers. Like, do they have the adaptations they need to stick around? I'm seeing a lot of people saying, no deal. And you are right. Hummingbirds do not stick around. They don't have any fat. They're not very fluffy. They don't have a lot of insulation. So often these birds, they'll just leave. You won't see hummingbirds in the winter. And you can tell kind of by looking at them. They're not really built for the cold weather. So good job. Not all birds, stick around, and not all birds leave. How about a wood frog? It's a tricky one there. Amphibians. Do you think they're well adapted to be active in the cold? Remember, they have thin, permeable skin. But do they migrate? Do they leave? Maybe they hop away and get out of there where it's warmer. I see you got some people in the middle thinking they're tolerators. And that's absolutely right. See, I can't fool you all. It's their tolerators. So they will brumate. Remember, that's the word for reptiles, amphibians that are hibernating. They'll actually dig in the mud and where it's kind of, a bit warmer, and then they'll freeze. Their temperature will lower and they'll almost freeze. They've kind of got like antifreeze in their systems. And then when the temperatures warm up, they'll reactivate and they'll be off doing things again. But in those cold times, they kind of get in the mud and then they're brumating. So good job, everyone. Couldn't fool you again. You remembered. How about that monarch butterfly? Insects have it tough because a lot of insects, honestly, they don't make it through the winter. Their life cycles, they lay the eggs, and those eggs might be something that's left come spring. But, a lot of insects die and they just have to restart their life cycle in the spring. But these ones are really unique. I see everybody saying that they don't like winter. Yeah, they're not adapted for it. They don't have any fur or feathers. Really easy to lose heat. So they absolutely do leave. They get out of Dodge. They do that big migration. They leave Canada. They go down all the way to Mexico. And again, that's done in multiple stages on the way down. And then they make their way back seasonally. So amazing job. Round of applause for everyone, because you remembered a lot of those facts and you looked at all the characteristics, and I think you did a really good job of telling. And there was maybe a couple ones where I almost tricked you, but you did a really fantastic job. So with that, I just wanted to talk a bit about some of the things you can do to help wildlife in winter. Because maybe we don't think about wildlife very often because we don't see them. They're not as active. Sometimes they might, like we've seen maybe some of the birds and things, maybe the deer. But there's things we can do to help wildlife in winter. And the first one we can do is leave our leaves on the ground. So in the fall right now, the leaves are falling. A lot of people like to rake up the leaves and put them in bags, put them in their compost bin, just because they like their lawn to look nice and clean. But those leaves are actually fantastic hiding spots and hibernation spots for things like insect eggs, even small mammals and things, piles of rocks and debris and logs. And what we think is mess, that's really fantastic for animals and wildlife that are overwintering. So if we can do our best to leave the leaves on the ground, and along with that too, if you have a garden, let it go wild. If the plants are dying and falling on the ground and they don't look very nice, that's kind of great because it's leaving all these hiding places for critters and crawlies. And so we kind of have to retrain our brains to think, oh, no, that is really good, because we think, oh, we're going to clean it up and make it perfect. But if we take away all that litter, it's not helping the soils. It's not providing places for those critters to hang out. So think about if you've got a garden or a yard, to leave some of the leaves, leave some of the twigs, some of the plant debris, because that's often where insects and small mammals and things will hang out throughout the winter. The other one, which is kind of tricky, is feeding animals in the winter. So the recommendation is not to feed mammals, so deer and things, because they become reliant on you for a food source, and that can be dangerous for them. It also can be a way that disease gets transported. If too many animals come to one place, or let's say the feeding station gets dirty, it can spread diseases, and that causes a lot of problems. The one exception that a lot of researchers are saying is birds. Birds do have a tough time sometimes over the winter having enough feed. So I would say you could set up a bird feeder, but do your research, because different types of bird feeders are appropriate for different types of birds. So there's different shapes of bird feeders, different types of bird seed and food. Some birds eat fruit and others nuts and seeds. Different beak shapes eat different sizes of seeds. So if you put something out They might, I don't know if you've done it before, they might eat one type of seed and leave everything else. It's because their beaks are adapted to eating certain things. So you might want to do a bit of research and say, okay, what kind of birds live in my area? And what kind of bird seed do they eat? And what kind of bird feeder is good? Where should I put the bird feeder so it's in a safe spot? So say cats can't get at it, or maybe it's not in the wind. And then the other big thing about bird feeding is if you start doing it at the beginning of the year, be consistent, because that bird knows that that's a place where food is. If you stop doing it halfway through the year, then they have to go find different sources of food and they expend energy. So you have to be consistent and clean your bird feeders, right? Got to keep them clean, because otherwise they could become like, if you didn't wash a dish and you used it over and over again, it'd be really gross. So you've got to keep them clean. So yeah, I think when it comes to feeding birds, just do a little bit of research and make sure you're not harming the birds, that you actually are helping them. And then finally, just a couple notes about wildlife in winter and keeping distance. So always good to keep our distance from wildlife, but you can imagine in the winter, it's really hard on wildlife to expend energy. The big thing that wildlife do in the winter is they try not to do it. They don't move around a lot. They conserve that energy. They've got those insulating layers to keep the heat in, not have a lot of food. So stressed animals don't do very well in the winter. So it's just good tips. If you're out hiking or recreating or outside and you see wildlife, just keep your distance. The other thing is to make sure you stay on trails and limit the disturbance of habitat. So we talked about how mice like to live in the subnivean zone under the snow. If you kind of cut a chunk into a snowbank and look, you'll see layers, and usually there's a little melted area at the bottom where they can move around. If you even want to try it, taking a thermometer and measuring the temperature, you'll notice it's a little bit warmer near the ground. But if we step off trail and step all over the snow and compact it, that gets rid of that layer at the bottom. Or if we ride our ATVs off-road and compact that snow, the mice have to come up out into the open where they can be seen. And I bet you can guess what would happen to them if they have to come out of that nice, secure spot. An owl might see them, a fox might see them, and they might become food for another animal. So it's just good advice if you're recreating outside in the winter and enjoying the winter because you're a snow lover, just to make sure that you're keeping your distance and you're trying to stay on those maintained trails or paths just so wildlife don't get disturbed or stressed. So those are just a few tips. Obviously, we, even when we aren't wanting to go outside, we can think about our adaptations, put our coats on, our hats on, so that you can have a fun time, because winter really is a really fantastic time for humans to be outside too. But we want to be mindful of the wildlife. So just some tips for all of you. And I think with that, we want to turn it back to Rebecca and see if we've got any questions coming in.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you very much. I know I can say for myself, I already learned a few things and I used to teach some. So I'm sure the kids learned a lot already today, but we do have a couple questions coming in already. First one, do squirrels and chipmunks hibernate? And then questions about climate change and extreme temperatures. What would those effects have on hibernators or migrators?
Those are fantastic questions. Yeah, so squirrels and chipmunks aren't really true hibernators. One cool adaptation that they have is that they cache food. And so I don't know if you've ever seen a squirrel getting pine cones and things. They will collect, and they'll store them somewhere, like in a tree trunk. So they have food to eat all throughout the year. And what's cool about squirrels is they're really good at spreading seeds, because they forget where they put half of the stuff that they hide. They hide all this stuff and then they forget where they put it. And the ones they forget will grow into trees and plants and things. But then they have a stash. And some birds do that too. There's a really cool bird. Some of them, they'll stick seeds and things in trees and they'll eat them. So squirrels and chipmunks are active throughout the winter, and they've got those caches of food that they've stored up, but they do also sort of go into torpor. So on the really cold days, they're like a mini hibernation. They're not as active. They might cool down and become less active, but yeah, they're not really full hibernators. So hopefully that answers that question. And then the other one you said was around, one thing that we realized as humans is just that our actions, we didn't intend to change the climate, but all these unintended things happen. So people are starting to really look at how it's impacting animals. And some things that are really they're noticing, it's the study of phenology, is how plants are changing. So In cities, sometimes their leaves will drop sooner because of the warmer temperatures. If even plants that are near street lights, they'll lose their leaves faster on one side if that side was exposed to more light. So temperature will change the plants, they'll lose their leaves sooner. And that's causing problems for animals because they were adapted maybe to have different seasons. So they've got the ones that are more successful are the ones that are adapting alongside their food sources. So it means like maybe earlier leaves dropping. It means that there's this gap between fall and winter where there isn't maybe as much food. So some animals are going into winter with less fat reserves. Bears need to eat a lot of stuff. If they can't get enough food, they're not going to be as healthy when they come out the other side. And actually, I don't know if anyone's heard of Fat Bear Week, but the National Park Service in the US does a whole competition. It's like a bracket, and they have all these bears in the park, and they say they're fat bears. And it's a competition of which bear is the fattest, because that's what bears are trying to do. They're trying to eat as much food as they can so they can go into kind of their mini hibernation or torpor. And so check it out if you haven't seen it. But they want to be as fat as they can going into winter. But if they can't find that food because the climate's changing, their resources aren't available, they're going to be skinnier when they come out. And if you're skinnier, you're not as healthy. Maybe you're going to be more likely to catch diseases. So to answer kind of what the climate change impact is, yeah, we don't fully know, but it changes the availability of food, changes when it's triggering those changes in color. Animals might be off sync, maybe they were used to changing color later and now they're the wrong color in the wrong season, so they might get eaten. It's really complicated, but that's something that if you're interested in being a scientist or researcher, these are some great questions that we can be looking into to learn more about how climate affects people too. People and animals, we all live in these habitats. So it's complicated, but we're starting to see some of the impacts for sure.
It's such a big question because, like you said, we don't even know for a lot of these what tells them to migrate. So then the whole extra step of what happens when we change those signals. So yeah, that's a very big, very complicated question for sure.
Yeah.
And we have a couple other, one of our students is asking here about foxes. Do you know if foxes are migrators? Do they love, they fear?
I don't know every fox species because there are a lot of species, but like Arctic foxes, really well adapted. I think things like red foxes have thick fur as well, but they're a little less active. So I think it depends on the species. And even swift foxes in the prairies live in dens. They live in like abandoned badger burrows and things. So some of them do spend more time in dens. So it's a great research question. Really, it's almost, you can't even just look at one group of animal like bears or foxes. You have to look at different species. You have to look at where they are in different countries. And yeah, some of them are really well adapted to cold temperatures. Others probably are more likely to bed down in the dens and kind of tolerate the winter. So yeah, different
I can't
foxes.
picture little fox legs being that effective for a long migration, but hibernation for sure. Okay, and we have time for one more question before I do my wrap up. I don't know if you can answer this, but maybe you can give us some examples of some true hibernators in Canada. I don't know if you know how many there are, but a couple examples of some things that do hibernate.
Yeah, I don't know I don't know how many. That could be a big number, but a lot of them, from what I've learned, is things like marmots, bats. I'm talking about brumation to a lot of those reptiles like snakes and stuff. They're in it for a really long haul. It's tricky to tell. A lot of them, from what I've seen, are like those ground squirrels, marmots type of thing. They really have the most extended hibernation, like months and months and months, but really is a spectrum. And so it's like some are slightly more, some are slightly less. It's not, yes, you either do or don't. And it depends on a lot of factors, like a really long hibernation, if it's uninterrupted. But let's say you were snowmobiling in the backcountry where bears are hibernating, they can wake up from the noise. So maybe they would have been hibernating for longer, but something interrupted them. So that's another factor we have to think about, is some of them are true hibernators, but they can still get woken up if they're disturbed. And that's that spectrum, and they might not have as good of a hibernation each year. So yeah, in terms of true hibernators, a lot of ground squirrels, marmots, etc., and brumation, a lot of reptiles like snakes. But really, it's that whole, like, are you going to get a good hibernation or not? Depends on a lot of things.
Awesome. Okay, well, I do have a quick couple of reminders, because I know we are losing a couple schools here at the end of our hour. So just a quick reminder for those of us watching on YouTube later, we have a quick little quiz for you guys all to do. So a lot of our Canadian schools right now are learning about national parks. This is a great way to fit that in. It's just for us to get an idea of how you felt about the quiz, but it also is like a fun BuzzFeed quiz, so you get to see which national park you are. So you can do it individually, you can do it as a class, but it would be great if everybody watching could either scan this QR code or click on the link in the chat and let us know which national park you are. And my second reminder, if you haven't done so already, please make sure that you sign up for our newsletter. So if you like this event and you want to know about upcoming events with the Canadian Wildlife Federation or others, best way to do it is to scan this QR code and make sure that you are on our mailing list.